Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a warning etched onto propaganda posters across the fortress worlds of the Cadian Gate. The lettering is crude, stamped in red ink on cheap parchment, and it reads like something out of a fever dream. "Attention, citizens," it says. "Beware the zombie plague. All deceased must be burned within 6 minutes of death to prevent reanimation." 6 minutes. That is all the time you have between the moment someone you love stops breathing and the moment they open their eyes again with nothing behind them but hunger and the faintest echo of a soul that no longer belongs to them. 6 minutes to gather kindling, to find a flame, to do what no parent or child or lover should ever have to do to someone they held dear. And if you hesitate, if grief slows your hand, or disbelief clouds your judgment for even a heartbeat too long, then the thing that used to be your mother, your brother, your closest friend will rise from wherever it fell, and it will come for you with fingers that have already begun to rot, and teeth that no longer care what they bite into. This is not a nightmare. This is not some ancient ghost story whispered in the dark corners of a feudal world where superstition still holds sway over reason. This is the grim and terrible reality of life in the far future, in the galaxy of the 41st millennium and beyond, where the dead do not always stay dead, and where the forces responsible for their rising are far more ancient and far more malevolent than any mortal mind can fully comprehend. The zombie plague, also called the curse of unbelief, is one of the most horrifying weapons in the arsenal of the chaos god Nurgle. And its effects have been felt across thousands of worlds, across tens of thousands of years, leaving behind nothing but ash and bone and the hollow moaning of things that should have been allowed to rest. Tonight, we are going to walk through the full and terrible history of the zombie plague in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We are going to trace its origins back to the very earliest days of the Great Crusade, to a fog-shrouded moon, where the seeds of the greatest betrayal in human history were first planted in the wounds of a dying Primarch. We are going to follow its spread through the ages, from the fall of the Death Guard Legion to the campaigns of the Herald of Nurgle, from the grinding siege of Vrax to the catastrophic events of the 13th Black Crusade that shattered the fortress world of Cadia and tore reality itself in half. We are going to examine every strain, every variant, every twisted evolution of this supernatural disease, from the shambling hordes of classical plague zombies to the mutated nightmares known as poxwalkers, from the psychic terrors of the doubtworm to the neurone plague that once swept through the underhives of Necromunda. And we are going to look at how the Imperium of man has tried, often in vain, to fight back against a threat that turns its own citizens into weapons and its own dead into an enemy that never stops coming. So settle in. Let the ambient hum of a distant generator be your companion. Imagine yourself deep within the walls of some fortress monastery, far from the front lines, where the flickering light of a single lumen's globe casts long shadows across shelves of dusty data slates. And listen closely. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, the dead have stories to tell, and they are not finished telling them. Before we can understand the zombie plague, before we can make sense of the shambling hordes and the rotting corpses and the endless moaning that fills the corridors of infested hive cities, we need to understand something fundamental about the nature of disease in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Because plague in the 41st millennium is not simply a matter of biology. It is not merely the work of microorganisms following the blind dictates of evolution and natural selection. In this universe, disease has a patron, sickness has a father, and that father has a name that is whispered with equal parts dread and desperate reverence across a million worlds. His name is Nurgle. And to understand Nurgle is to understand why the dead walk. In the swirling madness of the warp, that parallel dimension of pure psychic energy that exists alongside the material universe, like a dark reflection in a broken mirror, there dwell entities, of unimaginable power. These are the Chaos Gods, beings born from the collective emotions and experiences of every sentient creature in the galaxy. They are not gods in the traditional sense, not creators who shape the universe with purpose and design, but rather they are the universe's emotional feedback given form and consciousness, and terrible, terrible hunger. There are 4 of these great powers, 4 thrones in the kingdom of nightmares, and each one feeds upon a different aspect of mortal experience. Khorne feeds on rage and violence and the spilling of blood. Estzench feeds on ambition and scheming and the desperate hope for change. Slaanesh feeds on excess and sensation and the pursuit of perfection in all its forms, no matter how depraved. And then there is Nurgle. Nurgle is the chaos god of disease, of decay, of despair, of entropy, and paradoxically, of rebirth. He is called the Lord of Decay. He is called the Plague Lord. He is called the Great Corrupter, the Master of Pestilence, the Fly Lord. But among his followers, among the countless billions of wretched souls who have turned to him in their darkest hours, he is known most commonly and most affectionately as Grandfather Nurgle, or simply Papa Nurgle, a name that speaks to something deeply unsettling about his nature. Because Nurgle is not, despite what one might expect, a being of malice and cruelty in the way that Khorne is cruel, or Slaanesh is sadistic. Nurgle is, in his own terrible way, a being of love. He genuinely cares for his followers, or at least he cares for them in the way that a gardener cares for his most interesting specimens. He does not wish them to suffer, at least not permanently. What he wishes is for them to accept the inevitability of decay, to embrace the cycle of death and rebirth that governs all living things, and to find joy in the process of falling apart. To Nurgle, every blister is a blessing, every boil is a badge of honor, every disease is a gift freely given, and the appropriate response is not horror, but gratitude. This is what makes Nurgle so dangerous, not his plagues, as devastating as they are, not his legions of bloated demons and rotting warriors, as formidable as they may be on the battlefield. What makes Nurgle truly terrifying is his philosophy, because in a galaxy defined by suffering and hopelessness and the grinding misery of daily existence under the uncaring boot of the Imperium, Nurgle's message of acceptance and surrender resonates with billions upon billions of desperate souls. When your child is dying of a plague that no medicae can cure, when your body is racked with pain that no drug can numb, when every waking moment is a fresh reminder of how little the universe cares about your existence, the whisper of Grandfather Nurgle can sound like the kindest thing you have ever heard. Let go, he says. Stop fighting. Accept my gifts, and you will never feel pain again. You will never fear death again. You will join my garden, and in my garden, nothing ever truly dies. Or it is a lie, of course. Or rather, it is the truth twisted into something monstrous. Because the followers of Nurgle do not escape suffering, they simply stop feeling it, which is not the same thing at all. Their bodies continue to rot. Their flesh continues to decay. Maggots burrow through their organs, and flies nest in their open wounds, and their insides turn to soup that sloshes behind cracked and weeping skin. But they do not feel any of it. The pain is gone, replaced by a horrible contentment, a chemical bliss born of infection and corruption that leaves them smiling even as their jaws fall off. And it is in this space between life and death, between consciousness and oblivion, between the human being that was and the rotting shell that remains, that the zombie plague finds its terrible purpose. Nurgle is old, yet he is ancient beyond mortal reckoning, having fully awakened in the warp during the second millennium of old Earth's history, when the great plagues of medieval Europe sent such a surge of despair and death through the collective psychic field of humanity that the raw emotional energy coalesced into something sentient. Every epidemic since then has fed him. Every pandemic has made him stronger. Every mother who wept over a feverish child, every soldier who watched his wounds turn gangrenous, every civilization that watched itself crumble under the weight of pestilence has added another drop to the ocean of power that Nurgle calls his own. And in all those millennia of brewing and fermenting and experimenting with new and ever more creative forms of disease, Nurgle has created countless plagues. But the sheer variety of his contagions is staggering, a testament to a being that approaches the creation of illness with the passion and dedication of an artist perfecting his craft. There is the Destroyer Plague, which manifests as swarms of demon flies that lay their eggs inside the bodies of their victims until their abdomens burst and release another wave of buzzing, biting carriers. There is Nurgle's Rot, the most infamous of his creations, a slow-acting infection that corrupts not just the body, but the very soul of the afflicted, gradually transforming them over the course of months or years into one of his lesser demons, a plague-bearer, condemned to serve in his legions for all eternity. There is the Bone Rack, which turns the skeleton to powder inside still living flesh. There is the Eye Rot, which does exactly what its name suggests. There is the Festering Shroud, the Liquefying Ague, the Gurgling Doom, and dozens upon dozens of others, each one a masterwork of biological and supernatural engineering. But among all of these, among the hundreds of named diseases, and the thousands more that remain unclassified, there is one that holds a special place in the mythology and the military history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. One plague that, more than any other, captures the essence of what Nurgle represents, the blurring of the line between life and death, the refusal to let anything rest, the cruel mockery of existence that continues long after the spark of genuine life has been extinguished. That plague is the Zombie Plague, and its story begins not in some distant corner of the galaxy, as not in the festering garden of Nurgle's own domain within the warp, but on a fog-shrouded moon orbiting a world called Davin, in the days when the galaxy was young and hopeful, and the Emperor of mankind still walked among his sons. Let us go there now. The story of the Zombie Plague, like so many stories in the grim and bloody history of the Imperium of man, begins with a betrayal. It begins with a lie told in the guise of friendship, with a wound inflicted by a weapon that should never have existed, and with the slow, agonizing corruption of the greatest warrior humanity had ever produced. It begins on Davin's moon, in the 203rd year of the Great Crusade, and if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echoes of what happened there, reverberating across 10,000 years of war and suffering and death. Davin was a feral world, was a planet of vast deserts and savage warrior tribes that had been brought into compliance by the Lunar Wolves Legion and their primarch, Horus Lupercal, some 60 standard years before the events that concern us. It was an unremarkable world in most respects, one of thousands that the Great Crusade had swallowed and digested on its relentless march across the galaxy. But Davin had a moon, and that moon was not unremarkable at all. The first time the Lunar Wolves had visited Davin, the moon had been a desert, dry and barren, and largely uninteresting. Horus had left behind a trusted officer, a mortal commander named Eugen Tember, to serve as planetary governor and oversee the world's integration into the growing Imperium. It should have been a simple posting, a bureaucratic assignment for a capable administrator. But 60 years is a long time, and in the shadow of the Great Crusade, terrible things can take root in forgotten places. When Horus returned to Davin at the urging of Erebus, the first chaplain of the Word-Bearers Legion, who claimed that Tember had turned traitor and was in open rebellion against imperial authority, what he found was not a desert moon at all. The landscape had been transformed. Where once there had been dry sand and barren rock, now there were swamps, thick, black, sucking bogs that seemed to breathe with a life of their own, exhaling clouds of yellowish mist that clung to the ground like a funeral shroud. The air was heavy with moisture and the stench of decay, that unmistakable sweet-sour smell of flesh that has begun to break down, of organic matter returning to the soil in the most unpleasant way imaginable. And in those swamps, rising from the muck with the slow, deliberate purpose of things that have forgotten what it means to be dead, were the corpses of Temba's garrison. This was the first recorded encounter between the forces of the Imperium and what would later come to be known as plague zombies. The soldiers of the Imperial army, who had been stationed on Davin's moon under Temba's command, had been transformed. The fog-shrouded swamps had done something to them, or rather, something had been done to them through the swamps, because the power that had twisted this moon from a desert into a pestilential nightmare was not a force of nature. It was a force of the warp. It was the touch of the entity that the native Davinites called Nerg-Leth, a name that would later become terrifyingly familiar to every living being in the galaxy. Yes, the Lunar Wolves, 400 of the finest warriors humanity had ever produced, accompanied by 3 titans of the Legio Mortis and 4,000 soldiers of the Byzantine Janizars regiment of the Imperial army, made landfall on the moon, expecting a straightforward military engagement against rebel forces. What they got instead was a nightmare. The zombies came out of the swamp. They rose from the muck beneath the boots of the advancing soldiers, clawing their way up through the thick black mud, with fingers that had already begun to soften and separate. They emerged from pools of standing water that bubbled with marsh gas and the byproducts of decomposition. They shambled out of the mist in ones and twos, and then in dozens, and then in hundreds, a tide of rotting flesh and blank staring eyes that just kept coming, kept pushing forward, as kept reaching for the warm bodies of the living, with the single-minded determination of things that had been reduced to nothing but appetite. 2 captains of the Lunar Wolves, Tarik Torgadan and Garviel Loken, found themselves fighting side by side against the Horde, and their exchange during the battle would become one of the most famous conversations in the recorded history of the Great Crusade. Torgadan, slashing through zombie after zombie with growing frustration, turned to Loken and said, essentially, that he must have killed 100 or more of the cursed things. And Loken, with the dry wit that characterized him even in the worst of circumstances, replied that Torgadan was probably just killing the same one over and over, because if you did not destroy the head, they simply got back up again. It was a joke, but it contained a vital piece of tactical information that would be rediscovered and relearned by Imperial forces countless times over the next 10,000 years. Plague zombies are extraordinarily difficult to put down permanently. Conventional weapons fire, the kind of massed lasgun volleys and bolter rounds that can annihilate entire formations of living soldiers, is far less effective against enemies who do not feel pain, do not bleed out, and do not need functioning organs to continue moving. A zombie with a hole the size of a fist blown through its torso will keep walking. A zombie missing both arms will try to bite you instead. A zombie cut in half at the waist will drag itself forward on its remaining limbs, still reaching, still hungry, and still driven by whatever fragment of the curse of unbelief has taken up residence in what remains of its rotting brain. The only reliable way to stop one permanently is to destroy the head, to obliterate the brain, and sever whatever connection the warp energy maintains with the corrupted flesh. But that was not the real horror of Davin's moon. The real horror was waiting at the heart of the swamp, aboard the corroded wreck of a crashed Imperial starship, where Eugen Temba had made his lair. Temba was no longer recognizable as the capable, trustworthy officer Horus had left behind 60 years ago. The power of Nurgle had transformed him into something monstrous, a bloated, swollen thing that barely resembled anything human, oozing with corruption and radiating a palpable aura of disease. He had been given a weapon, a blade of ancient Xenos origin called the Kinebrak Anathame, a relic of chaos that had been stolen by Erebus from the collection of a human civilization called the Interrex, and secretly placed in Temba's hands as part of a conspiracy that stretched back decades. This blade was no ordinary weapon. It was a thing of the warp, consecrated to the plague god, and its touch carried with it a poison that could bring even a Primarch to the brink of death. Horus killed Temba. He crushed the bloated thing that his friend had become, and put an end to the misery that 60 years of Nurgle's embrace had wrought. But in the process, Temba struck back, driving the anatheme into Horus's shoulder, and the Primarch fell. the wound should not have been mortal. Horus was a Primarch, one of 20 demigod warriors, engineered by the Emperor of mankind himself, beings whose genetic makeup was so far beyond baseline human that they were effectively a different species. Their healing abilities were extraordinary, their resistance to disease and poison virtually absolute. But the anathema was not an ordinary weapon, and the poison it carried was not an ordinary poison. It was the work of Nurgle, a concentrated dose of warp-tainted corruption that attacked not just Horus's body but his very soul, and against the power of a chaos god, even a Primarch's legendary constitution was not enough. What happened next? How the wounded Horus was taken to the Serpent Lodge on Davin's surface, how Erebus and the Chaos cultists who ran the lodge used sorcery to send his soul into the warp, and how the Chaos gods themselves appeared to him in vision and seduced him with lies and half-truths, until the greatest of the Emperor's sons agreed to betray his father. All of that is a story for another time. It is the story of the Horus heresy itself, the most devastating civil war in human history, and it deserves its own telling. What matters for our purposes tonight is this. The events on Davin's moon were the first time that the forces of the Imperium encountered the living dead in any significant numbers. They were the first documented case of the warp being used to reanimate human corpses and turn them into mindless, flesh-eating engines of destruction. And they were the opening act in a drama that would play out across 10,000 years. As the plague that had transformed a moon into a graveyard evolved and spread and mutated into something that would one day threaten the very survival of the Imperium itself. The zombies of Davin's moon were crude by later standards. They were simple revenants, corpses animated by the ambient warp energy that permeated the corrupted landscape, driven by nothing more than basic hunger and the lingering echoes of the Chaos God's influence. They lacked the sophistication of the plague strains that would come later, the complex infection vectors and the carefully engineered symptoms that would make the zombie plague such a devastatingly effective weapon. But they proved a concept that the forces of chaos would refine and perfect over the millennia to come. The dead could be made to serve, the fallen could be turned against the living. And in a galaxy where war was constant and the bodies of the slain covered the landscapes of 1,000,000 battlefields, the potential for an army that replenished itself from the ranks of its own enemies was a strategic advantage that no amount of imperial firepower could easily overcome. The seeds had been planted on Davin's moon. They would bear their most terrible fruit, not in the distant future, but in the very near one, aboard the warships of a legion that had once been renowned as the toughest and most resilient warriors the Emperor had ever created. The Death Guard were coming, and with them came the Destroyer. The fall of the Death Guard is one of the most tragic chapters in the long and bloody history of the Horus heresy, and it is impossible to understand the zombie plague, to truly grasp the scope and scale of what it would become, without understanding how an entire legion of the Emperor's finest warriors was broken, corrupted, and remade into the plague-bearing harbingers of a god they had never asked to serve. The Death Guard were the 14th Legion of Space Marines, created during the Emperor's Great Crusade to reunite humanity under a single banner after millennia of isolation and suffering during the Age of Strife. They were led by their Primarch, Mortarion, a gaunt and brooding figure who had been raised on the toxic death world of Barbarous, a planet shrouded in poisonous fog and ruled by cruel overlords who used sorcery and disease as weapons of oppression. Mortarion had grown up breathing poison, building up an immunity to toxins that would have killed any normal man 1,000 times over, and he had passed this incredible resilience on to his gene sons. The Death Guard were by any measure the toughest of all the Space Marine legions. They could endure conditions that would have broken any other warriors. They marched through chemical weapons fire without faltering. They fought in environments so toxic that even their power armor's life support systems were being pushed to their limits. And they did not stop, did not waver, did not show even the slightest hint of weakness. This was their identity. This was the core of who they were. The Death Guard endured. No matter what the galaxy threw at them, they kept going, kept fighting, kept pushing forward with a grim and relentless determination that earned them a reputation as the one legion you never wanted to face in a war of attrition. They were the Iron Men, yes, the stone-cold warriors who would walk through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side asking if that was the best the enemy could do. And it was this very strength, this legendary resilience, this stubborn refusal to yield to anything the universe could conjure, that made their fall so catastrophic. Because when the Death Guard finally encountered something they could not endure, something that their incredible constitution could not overcome, the shock of it was so profound, so existentially devastating, that it broke them in a way that no enemy had ever managed before. When the Horus heresy erupted and the galaxy was torn apart by civil war, Mortarion sided with Horus against the Emperor. His reasons were complex, rooted in a lifetime of resentment toward the father who had taken away his chance to defeat the overlords of Barbarus himself, in a deep-seated mistrust of psychers and sorcery that the Emperor's secret projects on Terra seemed to embody, and in the magnetic pull of Horus's charisma, which had been amplified and corrupted by the dark powers that now whispered in his ear. Mortarion committed his legion to the War Master's cause, and the Death Guard joined the march on Terra, the final battle that would determine the fate of humanity. But they never arrived, not as themselves at any rate. The Death Guard's fleet, carrying the full strength of the 14th Legion, embarked for Terra under the guidance of their first captain, Callus Typhon. What Mortarion did not know, what he could not have known until it was far too late, was that Typhon had already been corrupted. Long before the heresy, Typhon had been recruited into the service of Nurgle by the word-bearer Erebus, the same schemer who had orchestrated the events on Davin's moon. Typhon had been born on Barbarus, like Mortarion, and he carried the blood of the overlords who had once ruled the planet, giving him latent psychic abilities that he had been forced to suppress in a legion that despised all forms of sorcery. But those abilities, and the dark whispers that accompanied them, had led him to Nurgle's embrace years before the heresy made traitors of them all. When the Death Guard's fleet entered the warp, Typhon made his move. He killed the navigators, the psychers who guided Imperial starships through the treacherous currents of the immaterial realm, and claiming that they had remained secretly loyal to the Emperor. He assured Mortarion that he could guide the fleet to Terra himself, using his own suppressed psychic powers. And Mortarion, desperate to reach the siege in time, and trusting the warrior who had been at his side since their youth on Barbarus, agreed. It was a trap. Typhon did not guide the fleet to Terra. He guided it into the heart of Nurgle's domain, into a region of the warp where the Plague God's power was absolute and inescapable. And there, becalmed and helpless, with no navigator to find them a path back to real space, and no way to escape the suffocating embrace of the warp, the Death Guard were struck by the Destroyer Plague. The Destroyer was unlike anything the Death Guard had ever faced. It was not a natural disease. Thus, it was not even an unnatural disease in the way that the corruption on Davin's moon had been unnatural. The Destroyer was the most devastating plague in Nurgle's entire arsenal, a concentrated expression of his divine power, made manifest as a contagion that could not be resisted, could not be endured, could not be survived. It manifested as swarms of massive demon-spawned flies that poured through the corridors of every ship in the fleet, biting and stinging and laying their eggs inside the bodies of the transhuman warriors who had been engineered to be immune to every known disease in the galaxy. The Death Guard's legendary resilience, the very quality that defined them as a legion, became their worst enemy. Because while any normal human would have died quickly from the Destroyer's effects, sparing them the worst of the agony, the Death Guard could not die. Their enhanced physiology fought the plague with everything it had, keeping them alive and conscious long past the point where death would have been a mercy. Their organs rotted inside them, their flesh turned to jelly, their guts swelled and distended until their armor could barely contain them, and still they did not die. They lay in the corridors of their warships, surrounded by clouds of buzzing flies and the stench of their own decomposition, and they screamed and prayed and begged for relief that did not come. The suffering was beyond comprehension. These were warriors who had laughed at chemical weapons, who had shrugged off toxic environments that would have killed unaugmented humans in seconds. Now, they were writhing on the decks of their own ships, watching their bodies fall apart from the inside, unable to die and unable to stop the process. The psychic weight of their agony radiated outward into the warp, and Nurgle felt it, and he was pleased. No one knows exactly how long the Death Guard endured this torment. Time moves differently in the warp, stretching and compressing in ways that defy mortal understanding. It may have been days. It may have been centuries. What is known is that at some point, when the suffering had reached a pitch that even Mortarion himself could no longer bear, the Primarch did what he had sworn he would never do. He called out for help, and Nurgle answered. The bargain was simple, as all such bargains with the Chaos Gods appear to be at first. Surrender, and the pain would stop. Pledge themselves to Nurgle, and the Destroyer would release its hold on them, swear their souls to the Plague God, and they would never feel pain again. Mortarion accepted. Whether he did so willingly, or in a state of delirium, or with full knowledge of what he was sacrificing, the sources disagree, and the truth may never be known. But the result was the same. The Death Guard, all of them, every warrior in the fleet, were claimed by Nurgle. The Destroyer did not leave their bodies. It remade them. Their rotting flesh stabilized in a state of permanent decay, no longer deteriorating, but no longer healing either, frozen in a condition of living death that was at once horrifying and strangely resilient. Their power armor fused with their bodies, the ceramite bonding with corrupted flesh and bone, until it was impossible to tell where the marine ended and the machine began. Their weapons and vehicles were similarly transformed, their gleaming war machines corroding and mutating until they pulsed with the sickly green energy of the warp. They were no longer the Death Guard. They were Plague Marines now, the first and most terrible of Nurgle's mortal servants, and they would carry the Plague God's gifts to every corner of the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. There is a detail in the accounts of the Death Guard's fall that is often overlooked, but which deserves attention, because it speaks to the profoundly personal nature of the tragedy. Before the entire Legion was consumed, there was one Marine who fell before all the others. His name was Raheb Zuriek, and he was the first Death Guard to succumb to the Destroyer Plague. Mortarion, still clinging to the desperate hope that the situation could be controlled, tried to save Zuriek personally. As the Primarch of the Death Guard, the Lord of Death himself, labored over the body of one of his sons with all the skill and determination that his superhuman nature could bring to bear, trying to find some way to reverse the effects of the plague, to pull Zuriek back from the brink. He failed. The plague was beyond his ability to cure or even slow. And worse, death brought no freedom from its torments. Even after Zuriek's body had ceased to function in any meaningful biological sense, the Destroyer continued to work on his remains, as if determined to prove that there was no escape, not even the escape of the grave. Mortarion watched helplessly as the thing that had been Raheb Zuriek continued to suffer long after any merciful universe would have allowed it to stop. This was the moment, many scholars believe, or when Mortarion's resistance began to crack. Not the physical agony of the plague, which was beyond description, not the psychological horror of watching his entire legion rotting alive around him, but the specific personal tragedy of watching a single warrior die in front of him and being powerless to help. The Death Guard had been built on the premise that they could endure anything. They had laughed at diseases that killed lesser men. They had walked through chemical firestorms without breaking stride. And now, they could not save one Marine from one plague, and the implications of that failure resonated through Mortarion's soul like the tolling of a funeral bell. There is also the matter of Ignatius Grulgor, who occupies a unique and horrifying place in the history of the zombie plague. Sag Grulgor was the captain of the Death Guard's Second Grand Company, a brutal and unpleasant individual who had been posted aboard the Imperial frigate Eisenstein with orders to kill the loyalist captain Nathaniel Garrow and his company of Death Guard who had remained faithful to the Emperor. Grulgor failed in that mission, killed in a firefight on the gun decks when a stray bolt pistol shot ruptured a life-eater virus bomb that had been stored in the ship's armory. The virus should have been the end of Ignatius Grolgor. It was not. During the Eisenstein's desperate flight through the warp to bring warning of Horus's betrayal to Terra, Grolgor's corpse was reanimated by the power of Nurgle. He rose from death as a thing of pestilence and corruption, as a walking plague carrier whose mere presence spread disease and decay through the ship's corridors. Grolgor was, in essence, the very first Plague Marine, predating the transformation of the entire Death Guard Legion by a significant margin. His reanimation was a proof of concept, a small-scale demonstration of what Nurgle could accomplish when he chose to reach into the material world and deny death its claim on mortal flesh. Garrow and his loyalists managed to destroy Grolgor's reanimated form after a desperate battle, but the implications of what had happened were not lost on anyone who later studied the events aboard the Eisenstein. Nurgle could raise the dead. He could transform fallen warriors into plague-bearing horrors that retained enough of their original combat capabilities to pose a serious threat even to Space Marines. And he could do it to anyone, on any world, at any time, as long as the conditions were right and the warp's influence was strong enough. Grolgor himself would later be elevated to the rank of Demon Prince, his reward for being the first to demonstrate the potential of Nurgle's necromantic arts. But his significance to our story is less about his personal fate than about what he represented: the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one in which the boundary between life and death was no longer a fixed and unbreachable line, but a permeable membrane through which the forces of chaos could push their servants in either direction at will. The fall of the Death Guard also produced immediate military consequences during the Horus Heresy itself.
Now, before we keep going, I just want to take a quick second to share something personal here. Out of everything in 40k lore, the zombie plague stuff genuinely unsettles me the most. Not because the gore or the body horror, plenty of factions have that, but because of what the walking pox does to its victims. The idea that you're still conscious inside your own rotting body, watching yourself hurt people you used to care about, unable to stop any of it, that's a level of cruelty that honestly keeps me up at night sometimes. It's what makes Nurgle scarier than Khorne to me. Khorne just kills you. Nurgle takes everything that makes you human and leaves you around to notice it's gone. I think that's why this topic gets requested. It hits different than most 40k horror because it's not alien, it's familiar. We all know what zombies are. We've all seen the movies. But Games Workshop took that concept and made it so much more by adding a layer of theological dread on top of the biological nightmare. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
When the newly transformed Plague Marines finally arrived at the Siege of Terra, yet they were something that neither side had ever seen before. They were no longer the disciplined, methodical warriors who had earned a reputation as the finest siege troops in the Imperium. They were something else entirely, creatures of pestilence and decay whose very presence on the battlefield spread disease among friend and foe alike. The ground beneath their feet turned to rot. The air around them thickened with clouds of flies and the sweet sour stench of decomposition. Their weapons, which had once been precisely maintained instruments of war, now oozed with infectious slime and pulsed with the sickly green light of Nurgle's favor. It is recorded that Mortarion personally led his pustulant Plague Marines into the thickest fighting at the Siege of Terra, and the horror that their appearance caused among the defenders was almost as effective as their weapons. These were Space Marines, warriors who had been created to be the Emperor's finest, the paragons of humanity's potential, and they had been reduced to walking corpses in power armor, shambling across the battlefield with the slow, deliberate gait of beings for whom time had lost all meaning, dragging behind them the stench of 10,000 plagues and the flies of a god who found beauty in decomposition. The heresy ended, eventually, with Horus's death and the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne. The traitor legions retreated into the Eye of Terror, and the Imperium began the long, painful process of rebuilding from the ashes of the worst civil war in human history. But the Death Guard did not simply disappear into the warp and wait for the next opportunity to strike. Unlike many of the other traitor legions, which fragmented into countless small warbands and spent as much time fighting each other as they did fighting the Imperium, the Death Guard remained largely intact as a fighting force. Their loyalty to Nurgle and the bonds that suffering had forged between them held them together in a way that the other legions could not match. Mortarion claimed a demon world within the Eye of Terror and reshaped it into a copy of Barbarous, complete with the toxic fog and the towering mountains and the miserable valleys where he had spent his childhood. He renamed it the Plague Planet, and it became the home base for the Death Guard's operations for the next 10,000 years. Yet the world was a factory of disease, a laboratory where Nurgle's most creative servants could experiment with new plagues and refine old ones, testing their creations on captured prisoners and willing volunteers alike before unleashing them on the Imperium. The Death Guard organized themselves into 7 plague companies, each one led by a powerful Chaos Lord, and each one dedicated to a particular aspect of Nurgle's pestilential philosophy. The first plague company, led by Typhus himself, was the largest and most active, its warriors and ships forming the core of the plague fleet that would terrorize the Imperium for millennia. The other companies, each with their own specialties and their own particular brands of horror, operated semi-independently across the galaxy, spreading Nurgle's gifts in ways that suited their individual temperaments and the tactical requirements of whatever campaign they happened to be engaged in. And throughout all of this, the zombie plague was being refined. It was being improved. It was being transformed from the crude ambient infection that had animated the corpses on Davin's moon into a precision weapon that could be deployed strategically, targeted at specific populations, and calibrated to produce specific effects. The Death Guard sorcerers, working in their plague laboratories on the Plague Planet and aboard the festering warships of the Plague Fleet, spent centuries perfecting the various strains of the Curse of Unbelief, learning how to control its rate of spread, how to adjust its lethality, how to maximize the number of functional plague zombies it produced, while minimizing the waste of biological material that occurred when the infection progressed too quickly and reduced the host body to useless slurry before it could be reanimated. The result of this millennia-long research and development program was not a single plague, but an entire family of related infections, each one tailored for a specific purpose, and each one devastating in its own particular way. But the truly important development, the one that would have the most far-reaching consequences for the galaxy, was what happened to the first captain of the Death Guard, because Typhon's reward went beyond mere survival or transformation. And Typhon, the architect of this grand corruption, received the greatest reward of all. Yet he absorbed the full power of the Destroyer Plague, taking into himself the concentrated essence of the most devastating disease Nurgle had ever created. His body swelled to grotesque proportions. His skin and armor became one, fusing together into a single shell of corrupted ceramite and rotting flesh. Great funnels of pestilential bone burst from his back, and into these funnels poured thousands of Nurgle's demon flies, burrowing into him and through him, until his entire body became a living hive of buzzing, biting, disease-carrying insects. Callous Typhon was no more. In his place stood Typhus, the herald of Nurgle, the host of the Destroyer Hive, and the being who would become the single most prolific spreader of the zombie plague the galaxy had ever known. We need to talk about Typhus. We need to spend some time with this creature. Get this walking pestilence, this monster in Terminator armor who has spent 10,000 years crisscrossing the galaxy with a singular mission: to spread the gifts of Grandfather Nurgle to every world, every population, every living thing he can reach. Because if Nurgle is the architect of the zombie plague, then Typhus is its delivery system, its vector, its patient zero, and its tireless evangelist all rolled into one. Typhus was born as Callous Typhon on the planet Barbarous, the same poisonous death world that produced his primarch Mortarion. But while Mortarion was a pure-blooded son of his adoptive world, raised among the human settlements in the toxic valleys below the mountain peaks where the overlords dwelt, Typhon was something else entirely. He was a half-breed, the product of one of those very overlords taking a liking to his human mother, a violation that resulted in the woman being drowned by her own neighbors for the shame of it. The child survived, carrying in his veins the blood of both humanity and the mutant psycho warlords who had terrorized Barbarous for generations. This dual heritage manifested as powerful latent psychic abilities that Typhon was forced to suppress and hide from the moment he was old enough to understand the danger they represented. Mortarion despised psychers. He hated sorcery with a passion born of his childhood under the Overlord's rule, and this hatred became a defining characteristic of the Death Guard Legion. A space marine who displayed psychic abilities was viewed with suspicion and mistrust, so Typhon buried his gifts deep, presenting himself as nothing more than a supremely capable warrior and tactical mind. But the powers were there, smoldering beneath the surface, and they drew the attention of forces that Typhon could not have fully understood at the time. The word-bearer Erebus, who was secretly working to corrupt the Space Marine legions from within, recognized Typhon's potential and recruited him into the warrior lodges, the secret brotherhoods that would serve as the vehicle for chaos corruption throughout the heresy. Through the lodges, Typhon was introduced to the truth about the warp and the beings that dwelt within it, and somewhere in that process, he made his choice. He chose Nurgle. By the time the heresy erupted, Typhon was already a devoted servant of the Plague God. He working behind the scenes to guide events toward the moment when the entire Death Guard would be delivered into Nurgle's hands. He was the one who killed the navigators. He was the one who led the fleet into the warp. He was the one who stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Terminus Est, and welcomed the destroyer Plague as it swept through the fleet, knowing that his reward awaited him on the other side of his legion's suffering. And what a reward it was. The transformation of Callous Typhon into Typhus the Traveler was not merely a physical change, though the physical changes were dramatic enough. It was an apotheosis, an elevation from mortal champion to something approaching demonic in nature. The destroyer hive that took up residence in his body was not just a swarm of plague-carrying insects. It was a living manifestation of Nurgle's power, a perpetual motion machine of disease and corruption that generated an endless supply of demon flies from the decomposing flesh within Typhus's armor. These flies carried with them a cocktail of supernatural diseases that could infect and kill virtually anything they came into contact with, and they poured from every crack and vent in Typhus's ancient Cataphractii pattern Terminator plate in a constant, buzzing cloud of pestilence. In addition to the destroyer hive, Typhus wielded a weapon called the Man Reaper, a massive power scythe called Lacrimae that was both a demon weapon and a force weapon, meaning it could channel psychic energy through its blade to kill with a thought as well as with its physical edge. The scythe was, according to unverified reports, and dipped in Nurgle's own cauldron of filth, and its touch carried diseases that could kill even beings normally immune to infection. But the weapon that concerns us most tonight is not a scythe, and not a swarm of flies. It is the zombie plague itself, because Typhus is identified in Imperial records as the primary vector for the curse of unbelief, the being from whom the most virulent and widespread strains of the disease have originated. Wherever Typhus goes, the zombie plague follows, spreading outward from his presence like ripples from a stone dropped into a still pond. His plague fleet, led by the Terminus Est, has visited 100,000 worlds over the course of 10 millennia, and on each one, the pattern repeats. First the disease, then the death, then the rising. The Terminus Est itself deserves a moment of our attention. This is Typhus's flagship, a warship so ancient that it was old even when the Horus Heresy began some 10,000 standard years ago. It is a vessel encrusted with the accumulated filth of ages, its hull a living ecosystem of mold and fungus, and things that should not be able to survive in the vacuum of space, but somehow do anyway. The ship exists on the boundary between real space and the warp, and its three-pronged silhouette is one of the most dreaded sights in the entire segmentum obscurus. When the terminus est appears in a system, planetary governors know that their world has been marked for death. Evacuations begin, panic spreads, and the more pragmatic administrators start calculating how long it will take to burn every corpse on the planet before the plague can take hold, because that is what Typhus does. But he does not simply attack worlds with military force, though his Death Guard warriors and the hordes of cultists and demons that accompany him are more than capable of overwhelming any but the most heavily defended targets. His true weapon is the plague itself, the zombie plague in particular, which he unleashes before his fleet even arrives in a system. Plague hulks, derelict ships filled with disease and set adrift in the warp, wash up in Imperial space like rotting driftwood, their interiors crawling with contagion. Infected cultists are seeded on target worlds months or years before the main assault, mingling with the population and spreading the disease through contact, through contaminated water supplies, through 100 vectors that the Imperial authorities are rarely prepared to counter. By the time Typhus's fleet arrives, the groundwork has already been laid. The dead are already walking. After the Horus heresy ended, after Horus was slain by the Emperor aboard the War Master's flagship and the traitor legions retreated into the Eye of Terror, Typhus made a decision that would shape the course of galactic history. While Mortarion withdrew to the demon world he had claimed, reshaping it into a miserable copy of Lost Barbarous and brooding in his dark fortress, Typhus refused to follow. He was sickened, if a being of his nature could be said to experience such an emotion, by what he saw as Mortarion's sentimentality. The Primarch was looking backward, mourning what had been lost, recreating the world of his youth, as if he could somehow undo the consequences of his choices by surrounding himself with familiar misery. Typhus had no interest in nostalgia. His loyalty was to Nurgle, not to Mortarion, and Nurgle's will was clear. Spread the plague, spread it everywhere, carry it to every world, every system, every sector of the galaxy. Let no corner of the Imperium be safe from the Grandfather's gifts. So Typhus took his ship and his followers, and he went to work. For 10,000 years, he has been the herald of Nurgle, in the truest sense of the word, a wandering prophet of pestilence who travels from system to system, spreading disease and death and the zombie plague wherever he goes. He has returned to the mortal realm again and again, leading his plague fleet on campaigns of devastation that have left entire sectors reeling. He has unleashed the zombie plague on hive worlds, where billions of densely packed humans provide the perfect breeding ground for infectious disease. And he has contaminated agri-worlds whose food exports feed entire subsectors, turning nutritious grain into vectors for the curse of unbelief. He has even carried his plagues into the warp itself, battling the demons of rival chaos gods in Nurgle's garden and emerging covered in new and ever more creative forms of corruption. And throughout it all, throughout 10 millennia of ceaseless campaigning, Typhus has maintained an attitude that is perhaps the most disturbing thing about him. He is happy, not in the hollow, chemical way that Nurgle's lesser followers are happy, not in the blank-eyed, drooling contentment of a plague marine who has forgotten what pain feels like. Typhus is genuinely, actively, enthusiastically happy with his work. He sees himself not as a destroyer but as a liberator, as a being who is freeing the galaxy from the tyranny of hope by showing its inhabitants the truth that Nurgle has revealed to him, that everything decays, that nothing lasts, and that the only honest response to the universe's fundamental indifference is to stop struggling and let the rot take you. He is, in his own way, the most faithful servant any god has ever had, and the zombie plague is his gospel. Now we need to examine the plague itself. We need to look at the mechanism, if such a mundane word can be applied to something so thoroughly supernatural, by which the zombie plague transforms living, breathing, thinking human beings into shambling, moaning, flesh-eating abominations. Because the curse of unbelief is not a simple disease, it is not even a complex disease. when it is something that exists at the intersection of biology and theology, of viral infection and warp sorcery, and understanding how it works is essential to understanding why it is so terrifyingly effective and so impossibly difficult to stop. The zombie plague, formally designated as the curse of unbelief in ecclesiastical records, is classified by the Ordo Sepulturum of the Inquisition as a supernatural, chaos-infused infection created through the use of chaos sorcery blessed by Nurgle to alter a biological virus. That is a mouthful of technical jargon that essentially boils down to this: the plague is a real, physical disease that has been augmented and transformed by the power of the warp into something that violates the laws of biology and physics. At its most basic level, the zombie plague is a necrotic microorganism. It is a pathogen that attacks the body's cells and accelerates the process of decay, causing tissue to break down and organs to fail at a rate far beyond what any natural infection could achieve. The skin rots. The internal organs liquefy. The victim coughs and chokes and bleeds from every orifice as their body literally falls apart from the inside out. It is an agonizing way to die, a process that can take hours or days or weeks, depending on the victim's constitution and the particular strain of the plague they have been infected with. But the physical symptoms, as horrifying as they are only half the equation. The zombie plague is not just a biological infection, it is a spiritual contagion as well, and this is what makes it truly unique among the countless diseases that afflict the galaxy. As the curse of unbelief gets its name from its most peculiar characteristic. It can only infect those who are consumed by despair. The plague specifically targets individuals who have lost hope, who have no faith in their hearts, who have been ground down by the relentless misery of existence in the 41st millennium, until there is nothing left inside them but weariness and resignation. The ecclesiarchy, the imperial church that oversees the spiritual welfare of the emperor's subjects, teaches that the disease afflicts only those lacking a pure faith in the emperor of mankind. Whether this is literally true or simply a convenient theological explanation for a phenomenon that no one fully understands is a matter of considerable debate among the inquisitors who study the plague, but the practical implications are undeniable. Yet in the uncaring grind of imperial life, where factory workers toil in 12-hour shifts for the privilege of eating nutrient paste in overcrowded hab blocks, where conscripted soldiers are fed into the meat grinder of galactic war without anyone bothering to learn their names, where the average citizen lives and dies without ever seeing the sky or breathing clean air or experiencing a single moment of genuine happiness, the vast majority of the human population can be counted among the despairing. The zombie plague does not need to search very hard for victims. The Imperium, through its own systemic cruelty and indifference, has created the perfect breeding ground for Nurgle's most insidious gift. When the plague takes hold, as the physical and spiritual components work together in a process that imperial scholars have spent centuries trying to understand and have never fully succeeded in explaining, the biological pathogen attacks the body while the warp-borne element of the infection attacks the soul, draining the victim's life force and replacing it with a tiny fragment of chaos energy that will serve as the spark that reignites the corpse after death. The victim deteriorates rapidly, their body rotting from the inside out, coughing themselves to death over a long and painful period. When physical death finally comes, when the heart stops and the brain ceases to function, and the last flicker of genuine consciousness gutters out like a candle in a storm, the chaos energy within the virus activates. The corpse reanimates. The eyes open, but there is nothing behind them except hunger. The mouth moves, but the only sounds it produces are the moans and groans that have become the signature auditory horror of a zombie plague outbreak. The body rises, stiffly and clumsily at first, its movements awkward and uncoordinated, as the warp energy learns to manipulate dead muscle and decomposing bone. And then it begins to walk, drawn irresistibly toward the nearest source of living flesh, by an instinct that is not really an instinct at all, but a compulsion implanted by the same chaos energy that keeps it moving. The resulting creature is a plague zombie, and it is a thing of terrible simplicity. It does not think. It does not plan. It does not strategize or communicate or show any sign of the higher cognitive functions that once made it human. It is driven by a single overriding urge to feed on living flesh, and in doing so, to spread the infection to new victims. Every bite, every scratch, every contact between the zombie's corrupted bodily fluids and the broken skin of a living person carries the plague, and the cycle begins again. Infection, decay, death, reanimation. Infection, decay, death, reanimation. An endless loop that feeds on itself and grows with every iteration. Plague zombies share many characteristics with the archetypal zombies from ancient entertainment media of old Earth's age of progress. They are mindless, shambling, and cannibalistic. They move slowly, their decomposing muscles unable to produce the coordinated movements required for running or climbing. They are individually weak, easily dispatched by a trained soldier with a clear head and a steady aim. But they are also extraordinarily resilient. They do not feel pain. They do not bleed out. They do not need to breathe or eat or sleep in any conventional sense. And the only way to put one down for good is to destroy the brain, to sever the connection between the chaos energy that animates the corpse and the nervous system through which it exerts its control. This last point is critical because it means that conventional military tactics, the tactics that the Imperial Guard and the Space Marines have spent 10,000 years perfecting against living, breathing enemies, are often woefully inadequate against the walking dead. A lasgun shot to the chest that would drop a human soldier will barely slow a plague zombie. A bolter round that detonates inside the torso will blow a hole the size of a melon through the creature's midsection, and it will keep coming. Even the loss of limbs is not necessarily fatal, as zombies have been observed continuing to crawl and bite and spread infection long after they have been reduced to little more than a torso and a head. The tactical implications of this have been studied extensively by Imperial military scholars, and the resulting doctrines are as grim as one would expect. Standard Imperial Guard procedure upon encountering plague zombies calls for concentrated fire on the head and upper torso, prioritizing destruction of the brain above all other targets. Flamer units are considered essential in any force that expects to engage the walking dead, as fire is one of the most reliable methods of destroying a plague zombie. The Promethium-based fuel used in Imperial flamers burns hot enough to consume corrupted flesh and bone alike, and it has the added advantage of potentially sterilizing the surrounding area against further infection. Heavy weapons, such as autocannons and heavy bolters, are also effective. Their high rate of fire and devastating impact compensating for the difficulty of making precise headshots in the chaos of a combat situation. But perhaps the most effective weapon against plague zombies is also the simplest: fire in volume. The death corps of Krieg, who have extensive experience fighting the walking dead from the siege of Vrax, developed a doctrine of establishing kill zones as predetermined areas where massed firepower could be concentrated on approaching zombie hordes to maximum effect. These kill zones were typically established at choke points such as bridges, doorways, and narrow streets where the zombies' numbers could not be brought to bear and where the defenders' fire could be focused on a small, densely packed area. The key was not to kill every zombie that entered the zone, an impossible task when the horde numbered in the thousands, but to destroy enough of them quickly enough that the rest could not reach the defensive line before reinforcements arrived or ammunition could be replenished. Urban warfare against plague zombies presents its own unique set of challenges. In the cramped corridors of a hive city, where visibility is limited and engagement ranges are measured in meters rather than kilometers, the advantage shifts dramatically in favor of the undead. Zombies do not need to see to find their prey. They are drawn to the living by senses that are not entirely physical, the same warp-infused instincts that allow them to navigate in total darkness and locate victims through walls and barriers that would stop any living hunter. A squad of Imperial guardsmen holding a position in a hive city corridor might destroy dozens of zombies approaching from the front, only to be overwhelmed when more come through the floor below them, or the ceiling above them, or the walls on either side, bursting through structural weaknesses that the zombies' primitive instincts have somehow identified. Vehicles offer some protection, but less than one might expect. Zombie plague victims are not strong individually, but in sufficient numbers they can overwhelm even armored vehicles, piling onto the hull in such quantities that their sheer weight blocks vision slits, clogs track mechanisms, and eventually finds any gap or weakness in the vehicle's armor. There are accounts from the siege of Vrax of Lehman Russ battle tanks being immobilized by the sheer mass of plague zombies that had climbed onto them, their crew forced to abandon the vehicle and fight their way clear on foot when the hatches would no longer open against the press of rotting bodies. The psychological impact of fighting plague zombies is another factor that cannot be underestimated. These are not faceless alien invaders or armored traitors. They are, or were, ordinary people. Guardsmen who fought beside you yesterday, civilians you were sent to protect, friends, comrades, family members, loved ones. The moment of recognition, when a soldier realizes that the shambling corpse reaching for his throat is wearing the face of someone he knew, someone he shared meals with, someone whose name he spoke in casual conversation only hours before, is a moment of psychological devastation that no amount of training can fully prepare a person for. Imperial commanders have learned, often through bitter experience, that units deployed against plague zombie hordes need to be rotated regularly, not because of physical exhaustion, though that is certainly a factor, but because of the cumulative psychological trauma of killing things that used to be people. Even the hardened veterans of the death cause of Krieg, or who approach their own mortality with an indifference that borders on the pathological, have been observed showing signs of psychological strain after extended engagements with the Walking Dead. For regular Imperial Guard units, the strain is far more severe. Breakdowns, desertions, and even mass panic have been documented in units that were asked to hold the line against zombie hordes for too long without relief. The true danger of plague zombies, though, is not any individual creature. It is the exponential growth that occurs when the infection is allowed to spread unchecked. In the early stages of an outbreak, when only a handful of zombies are present, the situation may seem manageable. Yet a squad of well-trained guardsmen with clear orders and sufficient ammunition can hold a position against a small group of shambling corpses without too much difficulty. But each zombie that manages to bite or scratch a living person before it is destroyed creates a new potential zombie, and that new zombie will in turn create more, and those will create more still. And very quickly, the mathematical reality of exponential growth turns a minor nuisance into an extinction-level event. The first recorded instance of the zombie plague in the 41st millennium occurred on the world of Hydra Minoris in the year 757 of the 41st millennium. A quarantine was imposed by the Imperial Navy, but by then it was already too late. 23 billion uninfected people were trapped on the planet alongside a rising tide of hungry, mindless undead. The records do not specify how many of those 23 billion survived. Given what we know about the plague's infection rate and the difficulty of containing it once it reaches critical mass, the answer is likely very few. And Hydra Minoris was just the beginning. There are hundreds of documented strains of the zombie plague, each one a variation on the theme of death and reanimation, each one crafted by the endless creativity of Nurgle and his servants to exploit a different weakness, target a different population, or spread through a different vector. Some strains are purely biological, transmitted through bodily fluids like a conventional virus. Others are transmitted through contaminated water or food supplies. Still others have developed infection vectors so exotic that they defy conventional classification entirely. But consider the doubtworm, one of the most insidious variants of the plague ever documented. The doubtworm does not spread through physical contact at all. It spreads through the mind. The infection is psychic in nature, traveling from person to person, not through germs or bodily fluids, but through a tiny seed of doubt, a microscopic wavering in the victim's faith in the Emperor. At first, the doubt worm appears to be a standard zombie plague outbreak. The dead rise, they attack the living, and chaos ensues. But there are survivors, people who seem to be immune to the infection, who walk among the zombies unharmed. These survivors are not actually immune, however. They are the doubt worm's true carriers, its second-stage vectors, and they are far more dangerous than the zombies that surround them. The plague ignores space marines entirely, and because the Astartes carry a fragment of the Emperor himself in their gene seed, and their faith is absolute. But it feeds on the doubt that lurks in every ordinary human heart, the quiet, desperate question of whether the Emperor really does protect, whether the Imperium really is worth dying for, whether any of it matters at all. In the second stage of infection, the apparent survivors mutate. Their bodies transform into something no longer recognizable as human, a worm-like creature studded with multiple eye mouths and dominated by a single enormous eye that serves as both sensory organ and weapon. The doubt worm has evolved past the need for zombies entirely, having used the initial outbreak as nothing more than a smokescreen to identify and infect its true targets. Then there is the Fide strain, named for the area of the Calixis sector where it was first encountered. The Fide strain zombie plague follows a specific escalation pattern that has been documented in detail by the Ordo Malleus. It begins with a standard outbreak, the dead rising, the living fleeing or fighting, the usual horror. But as the outbreak intensifies, the Fide zombies begin to decay at an unnaturally accelerated rate, their flesh rotting away to reveal the bones beneath. At the same time, new entities appear, things that the Ordo Malleus has designated as vile savants. These are not zombies at all. They are warp-spawned diseases, made flesh, demons of pestilence that manifest in the material world, wearing sealed containment suits, slick with filth and beaded with moisture like sweat on fevered skin. Inside the suits, as there is nothing but liquefied flesh and writhing vermin, held together by the shape of the suit and the malevolent will of the demon within. The vile savants are the endgame of a Fide strain outbreak. They are the reason the plague exists, the harvesters that come to collect the crop of suffering and death that the zombie plague has sown. Each stage of the outbreak, from the initial infections to the rising of the dead to the full-scale collapse of social order, escalates the amount of death and horror until the psychic weight of it tears a hole in the barrier between real space and the warp. The dead walk, the vile savants come, and the world is claimed for Nurgle. But of all the variants and strains and mutations of the zombie plague, the one that has become most prevalent in the current age, yet in the dark days following the opening of the Great Rift and the birth of the era Indomitus, is the walking pox. And to understand the walking pox, we need to understand the creatures it creates. We need to talk about poxwalkers. The walking pox is, by some accounts, a variant of Nurgle's rot, the legendary plague that corrupts not just the body, but the soul, and transforms its victims into plague bearers, the lesser demons of Nurgle. But while Nurgle's rot works slowly, taking months or years to complete its terrible transformation, the walking pox is faster, more brutal, and in many ways more cruel. Because the walking pox does not simply kill its victims and reanimate their corpses, it keeps them conscious. Let me say that again, because it is important, and because the full horror of it tends to get lost in the broader context of galactic war and cosmic horror that defines the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The walking pox keeps its victims conscious. The person inside the rotting, shambling, moaning corpse is still in there. They are aware. They can see through their own decaying eyes as their body staggers through the ruins of their city, reaching for the people they used to know and love. They can feel the cold, wet sensation of their own flesh coming apart around them. They can hear the screaming of the living as they approach, and they want to stop. They want to turn away. They want to die properly and completely and finally. but they cannot. The walking pox has locked them inside their own corpse like a prisoner in a cell made of rotting meat. And all they can do is watch as their body does terrible things to people they care about. This is what a poxwalker is. It is not simply a zombie with a different name. It is a conscious being trapped in a dead body, forced to witness its own monstrous actions without any ability to intervene. It is perhaps the cruelest thing that Nurgle has ever created, which is saying something for a being whose entire existence is defined by the creation of suffering. Victims of the walking pox find their bodies rotting and shutting down until death eventually takes them. Their skin goes grey, and then green, and then black. Their eyes cloud over. Their fingers stiffen and curl. They cough blood and phlegm, and things that should not be coming out of a living body. And then they die, and for one brief terrible moment, there is silence and darkness and the promise of peace. And then they wake up. The reanimation is accompanied by physical mutation. Unlike standard plague zombies, which tend to look more or less like what they were in life, only deader, poxwalkers undergo continued transformation even after death. Their flesh sprouts growths, horn-like protrusions that erupt from their skulls in a grotesque parody of the plague bearers they might have become if they had been infected with Nurgle's rot instead of the walking pox. Tentacles push their way out of their torsos, pulsating with a sickly life of their own. Spikes of bone pierce through their skin at random points. They become something that is not quite a zombie and not quite a demon, but something horrible in between. As a transitional creature that belongs fully to neither category and is all the more disturbing for it. The walking pox spreads through mechanisms that Imperial scholars have struggled to classify. It can be transmitted through air. It can be transmitted through water. It can be carried in contaminated stimulants and injected directly into the bloodstream. But its most terrifying vector is sound. The groans that poxwalkers emit, the constant, low moaning that accompanies every moment of their undead existence, are themselves a form of contagion. The sound carries the plague through the air as a spiritual infection, bypassing the body's immune system entirely and attacking the soul directly. Anyone who hears the groaning of a poxwalker for too long, who lets that sound seep into their consciousness and erode their will to resist, is at risk of contracting the walking pox themselves. This is why poxwalkers are so devastating in large numbers. A single poxwalker is a slow, clumsy, individually weak enemy that any trained soldier should be able to dispatch without too much difficulty. But a horde of poxwalkers, dozens or hundreds or thousands of them moaning in unison, produces a cacophony that can damage the souls of nearby living creatures. The sound becomes a weapon in itself, weakening the spiritual defenses of everyone within earshot, and making them more vulnerable to infection. The larger the horde grows, the louder the moaning becomes, and the faster new victims are claimed. It is a feedback loop of horror that can turn a manageable situation into a catastrophe in a matter of hours. The Death Guard, who are the primary users of the walking pox in military operations, have refined the deployment of poxwalkers into a grim science. They use them as ablative shields, advancing behind walls of shuffling, moaning undead that soak up enemy fire while the plague marines trudge forward at their own inexorable pace. They deploy poxwalker hives, nightmarish structures that resemble industrial chimneys and from which pour swarms of demon insects, whose buzzing carries the walking pox to new victims. They even have specialized poxwalkers, called poxbursters, individuals who have somehow retained a small degree of lucidity through Nurgle's blessing, and who now carry explosive canisters strapped to their bodies, lumbering toward enemy positions with a ticking sound that grows more frequent and more frantic until they get close enough to sprint the last few meters and detonate themselves in a shower of diseased shrapnel and corrupted flesh. The walking pox can infect more than just humans. Once loyal canids, the tracking and guard dogs that serve alongside Imperial forces, can be transformed into poxhounds, undead hunting animals that retain their sense of smell and their pack instincts, but have lost everything else that made them loyal companions. These creatures hunt in packs, sprinting through the ruins of infected cities with a speed and coordination that their human counterparts cannot match. Typhus himself has a special relationship with poxwalkers. On the tabletop game that represents the wars of the 41st millennium, that Typhus has the ability to reanimate fallen poxwalkers, bringing them back into the fight even after they have been destroyed. This is not just a gameplay mechanic. It reflects a lore reality that Typhus's presence on a battlefield is like a psychic beacon for the walking pox, strengthening the plague's hold on its victims and making it more difficult for them to find the final piece of true death. Where Typhus walks, the dead follow. Where Typhus fights, the dead fight beside him. And where Typhus wins, the living become the dead, and the dead become the poxwalkers, and the cycle continues without end. The 13th Black Crusade was the event that transformed the zombie plague from a localized horror into a galaxy-spanning catastrophe. Before the 13th Black Crusade, outbreaks of the curse of unbelief were relatively rare, isolated incidents that could be contained with sufficient military force and a willingness to sacrifice the infected population for the greater good. After the 13th Black Crusade, after the fall of Cadia and the opening of the Great Rift, the zombie plague became a permanent feature of the galactic landscape, an ever-present threat that could strike anywhere, at any time, on any world in the Imperium. The build-up to the 13th Black Crusade was, in retrospect, a masterpiece of strategic planning by the forces of chaos. Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, and the architect of all 13 Black Crusades, understood that a frontal assault on the Cadian Gate, the narrow corridor of stable space that provided the only navigable route between the Eye of Terror and the wider galaxy, would require more than just military force. It would require the systematic weakening of the Imperial defenses in the surrounding sectors, the undermining of morale and logistics, and the basic ability of the Imperium to mount a coordinated response. And for that, he turned to Typhus. The opening moves of the 13th Black Crusade were not fleets of warships or legions of traitor marines. They were space hulks, massive conglomerations of derelict vessels that had been floating in the warp for millennia, their interiors crawling with disease and the desiccated remains of their original crews. These hulks began appearing in the Cadian sector in alarming numbers, emerging from the warp at seemingly random locations and drifting into shipping lanes and orbital paths. Some were intercepted and destroyed by Imperial naval forces. Some were boarded by space marines who found nothing but death and plague inside their corroded corridors. But many slipped through the defensive perimeter, and the crews of the Imperial ships that came into contact with them began to sicken. The plague spread quickly through the Imperial Navy. Warships are enclosed environments, their crews packed into tight quarters where disease can spread with terrifying speed. Within weeks, entire vessels were being quarantined as their crews succumbed to the mysterious infection. And the plague did not stop at the Navy. It jumped to the populations of the worlds that the infected ships visited, spreading through orbital stations and landing pads and cargo holds until entire planets were in the grip of an epidemic that no one could explain or control. As the epidemic spread, something else began to happen on the afflicted worlds. Apocalyptic cults sprang up, preaching that the Emperor's wrath had descended upon them as punishment for their sins. These cults, fueled by the despair and terror that the plague had sown, grew rapidly in number and influence, drawing in the fearful and the hopeless by the thousands. They called their movement the Plague of Unbelief, and they rioted against imperial authorities, burning medical facilities to the ground in their misguided attempts to halt the spread of the disease, and tearing apart the social fabric of worlds that were already struggling to cope with the crisis. And then the dead began to rise. On world after world, in the Cadian sector and the Agrippina sector and the Bellis Corona sector and beyond. Now the victims of the plague opened their eyes and climbed to their feet and began to walk. Plague zombies, thousands and then millions of them, shambling through the streets of hive cities and across the fields of agri-worlds and through the corridors of military installations, adding their numbers to the chaos that was already consuming the region. The hive world of Subiaco Diablo was one of the first and worst affected. Its dense urban population, crammed into towering habitation blocks, where millions of people lived in close quarters and shared recycled air and water, proved to be an ideal breeding ground for the plague. The world was quickly quarantined by the Administratum's Officio Medicae, but not before millions had already sickened and died and risen again. Within a solar month, as a dozen other worlds reported cases of the same plague, and panic spread throughout the segmentum obscurus, as transit between neighboring sectors was halted by the Imperial Navy in an attempt to stop further infection. The Imperial Guard forces in the region were pushed to the breaking point. They were being asked to simultaneously contain the zombie outbreaks, suppress the rioting cults, maintain quarantine lines around infected populations, protect essential infrastructure from the mobs of self-flagellating zealots who were destroying everything in their path, and prepare for what everyone now suspected was coming, a full-scale chaos invasion. There were not enough soldiers, not enough ammunition, not enough medici supplies, not enough anything to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. And then Typhus arrived, the terminus est, at the head of a chaos fleet that included the plague carrier Plague Claw, and a massive flotilla of plague hulks emerged into the Bellis Corona system and found a world that was already on its knees. The plague had done its work. The dead were walking, the living were in disarray, and the herald of Nurgle had come to reap the harvest. The hive world of Bellis Corona fell quickly. With its population already decimated by the plague and its defenders overwhelmed by the combined threat of zombies, cultists, and their own collapsing social order, it had little hope of resisting the Death Guard forces that descended upon it. Typhus's plague marines stalked through the streets, finishing off whatever organized resistance remained, while the hordes of plague zombies that accompanied them swelled with every passing hour as the newly dead rose to join their ranks. Meanwhile, Abaddon launched his main assault. A chaos warfleet of hundreds of ships surged from the Eye of Terror, led by the planet-killing superweapon that bore the appropriately terrifying name Planet Killer. The blighted world of Earthwort, where Kassakin scouts had found nothing but death and plague zombies, was annihilated by a single devastating blast, and the psychic death scream that resulted was felt by astropaths across the entire sector. The 13th Black Crusade had begun in earnest. What followed was a campaign of unprecedented scale and devastation. Chaos forces poured through the Cadian Gate and into the surrounding sectors, bringing with them not just military force, but the full weight of Nurgle's biological arsenal. The zombie plague continued to spread, carried by the plague fleets that accompanied the invasion force, seeded on world after world by infected cultists and contaminated supplies. On the planet Amistel, the plague marines of the Death Guard stalked across battlefields cluttered with the corpses of those the plague of unbelief had already claimed. On St. Josmain's Hope, the prison world that Abaddon's forces captured, and whose inmates were released to swell the ranks of the lost and the damned, the dead rose alongside the living to fight against the Imperium. On Cadia itself, the fortress world that had stood for 10,000 years as humanity's first line of defense against chaos, and Abaddon's cruelty found its fullest expression when 13 massive transports, filled with mutants, plague zombies, and chaos spawn, were deliberately crash-landed into the ruined city of Casa Karkovan, ensuring that many of the final assaults on the planet's defenders were performed by the most expendable and most horrifying elements of his forces. Cadia fell. That is the brutal, unvarnished truth of it. Despite the heroism of its defenders, despite the sacrifice of millions of soldiers and the intervention of Space Marine chapters from across the galaxy, Cadia could not be held. Abaddon destroyed the planet itself, cracking its ancient pylons and unleashing the full force of the warp upon a world that had stood as a bastion of humanity for 10 millennia. The planet broke apart, its surface consumed by the warp, its people dead or scattered, its legacy reduced to a rallying cry that would echo through the centuries to come. Cadia stands, the survivors said, even as they fled the ruins of everything they had known. And when Cadia fell, the Great Rift opened. A massive tear in the fabric of reality, stretching from the Eye of Terror clear across the galaxy, splitting the Imperium in half and flooding the material universe with warp energy on a scale never before seen. The barrier between the realm of chaos and the realm of the living, always thin, was now thinner than ever, and the consequences for the zombie plague were immediate and catastrophic. Before the Great Rift, the zombie plague had been limited by the amount of warp energy available to power it. Outbreaks occurred in areas where the warp was strong, near the Eye of Terror, at near-warp storms, near places where the barrier between dimensions had been weakened by sorcery or demonic incursion. But the Great Rift changed the equation entirely. With warp energy flooding into real space at unprecedented levels, the plague mutated and evolved and proliferated in ways that had never been possible before. New strains appeared, dozens and then hundreds of them, each one tailored to exploit a different weakness or spread through a different vector. The weeping, the mutterflux, the slithering scourge, the somnambuphage, the spawn rot fever, the plague of despair. These are just a few of the names given to the new variants of the zombie plague that emerged in the wake of the Great Rift. Some spread through conventional biological vectors, transmitted by contact with infected individuals or contaminated materials. Others spread through means that defied conventional classification. One strain was said to be transmitted through nightmares, infecting people in their sleep through the psychic resonance of their own subconscious fears. Another spread through groans of misery, the literal sounds of suffering serving as a carrier for the warp-borne pathogen. A third was spread through the surrender to despair, meaning that the simple act of giving up hope was enough to trigger the infection. The zombie plague had gone from a localized threat to a universal one. No world in the Imperium was safe. No population was immune. And the Imperium, already reeling from the fall of Cadia and the splitting of the galaxy in two, had to face this new reality with half its military forces cut off behind the Great Rift, its supply lines severed, and its leadership in turmoil. This was the world that Reboot Guilliman, the resurrected Primarch of the Ultramarines, inherited when he woke from 10,000 years of stasis to find his father's Imperium on the brink of collapse. And among the many threats he had to contend with, from demonic incursions to Xenos invasions to the simple logistical nightmare of governing half a galaxy, the zombie plague ranked among the most pernicious and most difficult to counter. Because you cannot negotiate with a zombie. You cannot deter it with shows of force. You cannot break its will or undermine its morale or convince it that surrender is a viable option. All you can do is destroy it, and then destroy the next one, and the one after that, forever, because the plague will always create more. The zombie plague is, in the most fundamental sense, a war of attrition fought against an enemy with infinite reserves, and even the Imperium, with its trillions of soldiers and its galaxy-spanning industrial base, cannot sustain that kind of war indefinitely. But they try, because that is what the Imperium does. It endures. And the story of how it endures, of the soldiers and inquisitors and ordinary citizens who stand against the tide of the walking dead and refuse to let their world become another breeding ground for Nurgle's gifts, is a story that deserves its own telling. The Siege of Vrax was not the largest campaign in which the zombie plague played a significant role. It was not the most strategically important, or the most famous, or the most frequently referenced in Imperial propaganda. But it was, in many ways, the most emblematic, and the conflict that best illustrated the sheer grinding horror of fighting a war in which the dead refuse to stay dead and the battlefield itself becomes an enemy. Vrax Prime was an armory world, a planet dedicated entirely to the production, storage, and distribution of military supplies for the Imperial war machine. Its vast underground storage complexes held enough weapons and ammunition and equipment to supply entire sectors, and its population of 8 million souls existed for no purpose other than to maintain these stores and ensure their orderly distribution to whatever front required them. It was, in short, one of the most strategically valuable worlds in the segmentum obscurus, and when it fell to rebellion, the Imperium could not afford to let it stay that way. The rebellion was led by a man named Cardinal Zaffan, and a demagogue who had risen to power by preaching to the discontented workers and lower classes of Vrax's rigid social hierarchy. Zaffan claimed to speak for the Emperor, claimed that the Imperium had abandoned the common man, claimed that only through his guidance could the people of Vrax find salvation. When the Inquisition sent an assassin to eliminate him, the attempt failed, and the resulting outrage among Zaffan's followers erupted into open revolt. The Cardinal seized control of the planet, its garrison and its vast military stores, and declared independence from the Imperium. The Imperium's response was the 88th Siege Army, composed entirely of regiments drawn from the death corps of Krieg, and a world renowned for producing soldiers who were experts in siege warfare and who approached their own mortality with a fatalistic acceptance that made them ideally suited for the kind of grinding, attritional conflict that Vrax would demand. The siege began in the year 813 of the 41st Millennium, and it would last for 17 years before the planet was finally reclaimed. In the early years of the siege, the conflict was brutal but conventional. The death corps advanced slowly across Vrax's blasted surface, pushing through defensive lines and fortifications that Zaffan's forces had spent years constructing. The casualties were enormous on both sides, but the Krieg regiments had been raised specifically for this kind of war. They did not retreat. They did not surrender, but they accepted their losses with the same stoic indifference with which they accepted everything else, and they kept pushing forward, meter by bloody meter. Then the forces of Chaos arrived, and everything changed. Chaos Space Marine warbands, drawn to Vrax by the scent of suffering and the promise of plunder, descended on the planet from orbit. Among them were elements of the Alpha Legion under Arcos the Faithless, the bloodthirsty World Eaters, the siege specialists of the Iron Warriors, and most significantly for our purposes, several warbands dedicated to Nurgle. The Purge, infamous for their genocidal campaigns and their liberal use of chemical weapons. The Tainted, a large Death Guard sub-faction with a particular talent for creating mutated horrors. And the Apostles of Contagion, led by a Death Guard sorcerer named Necrosius the Undying, the self-proclaimed Hand of Nurgle. It was Necrosius who brought the zombie plague to Vrax. Necrosius was a bitter and twisted being, a Death Guard Chaos Lord and powerful sorcerer whose dark arts included the ability to raise the dead through the gift of the zombie plague. He had learned these terrible secrets from the suppurating lips of Nurgle's own demon kin, and he wielded them with a skill and enthusiasm that would have impressed even Typhus. When Necrosius and his Apostles of Contagion arrived on Vrax, they brought with them not just the military capability of Chaos Space Marines, but the full spiritual contamination of Nurgle's pestilential power. The effect on the siege was transformative. Vrax's battlefields, after years of continuous fighting, were littered with the bodies of the dead. Millions of soldiers from both sides lay where they had fallen, buried in shallow graves, or simply left to rot in the open air, because there was no one available to give them proper disposal. The no man's land between the siege lines was a charnel house, a landscape of decomposing flesh and shattered bone, and the rusted remains of destroyed vehicles, all of it slowly sinking into the toxic mud that had replaced whatever natural soil Vrax once possessed. For Necrosius, this was not a battlefield. It was a garden, and he intended to make it bloom. The sorcerer and his followers performed unspeakable rites of the darkest necromancy among the thousands of unburied dead. They chanted prayers to Nurgle in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. They anointed the corpses with unguents made from ingredients that no sane person would willingly handle, and the dead responded. They stirred in their graves. They pushed their way up through the mud and the rubble. They opened their eyes and climbed to their feet and began to walk. The Krieg regiments, already engaged in the most brutal fighting of the entire siege as the Chaos forces launched their counter-assault, suddenly found themselves fighting on two fronts. The enemy was no longer just in front of them. The enemy was below them, beneath their feet, rising from the very ground they stood on. The old battlefield had come back to life. The 262nd Krieg Regiment was among the first to report encounters with plague zombies. Then the 263rd. Then others, scattered across the siege lines, as all reporting the same thing. Corpses rising from the ground and attacking Imperial positions with the mindless, relentless determination of things that had nothing left to lose because they had already lost everything. The Death Corps soldiers, to their credit, did not panic. These were Krieg soldiers, men who had been raised from birth to accept death as a duty, and who approached their own destruction with the same bureaucratic efficiency they brought to everything else. They adjusted their tactics, aimed for the head, and kept fighting. But the zombies were only part of the problem. The Nurgle-aligned warbands had also gained access to Vrax's stores of prescribed chemical weapons, including a horrifying toxin designated TP3 that had been secretly dumped on the planet decades earlier. These chemical agents were deployed against the Krieg forces with devastating effect. The toxin could eat through gas masks and dissolve living tissue on contact. And where the gas was densest, entire platoons were wiped out in minutes, their bodies reduced to something that no longer resembled anything human. For the followers of Nurgle, the deployment of these weapons was not merely a tactical decision. It was a religious act, a consecration of the battlefield to their pestilential god, designed to break morale, spread disease, and transform Vrax into a festering plague world. The combination of plague zombies, chemical warfare, plague marines, mutants, and demonic entities made the final years of the Siege of Vrax a nightmare that tested even the legendary resolve of the Death Corps to its absolute limits. As after 8 days of vicious fighting that saw the guardsmen subjected to demon engines of Nurgle, chemical attacks, and twisted chaos spawn, the Krieg forces stalled in their advance. The situation deteriorated to such a degree that the Inquisitors overseeing the campaign authorized the counter-use of Imperial chemical weapons to break the stalemate, a decision that only added to the poisonous landscape and delighted Nurgle, who was more than happy to see both sides contributing to the transformation of Vrax into the kind of toxic, infectious hellscape that his children thrived in. The siege ground on for 17 long years. 34 regiments of the Astra Militarum were committed to the campaign before it was finally brought to a conclusion. The cost was staggering: 14 million Imperial Guardsmen killed. And along with the entire original population of Vrax Prime, all 8 million souls consumed by the violence or exterminated after they fell to the corruption of chaos. The planet was reclaimed technically, but it was reclaimed as a barren wasteland, poisoned and corrupted beyond any hope of rehabilitation. The Inquisition declared Vrax and its surrounding star system perdita, essentially writing them off as permanently lost, too contaminated to be worth the effort of restoration. Necrosius and his apostles of contagion disappeared into the void after the siege, their whereabouts unknown. But the lesson of Vrax was clear. In a war where the dead could be turned into weapons, every casualty on your own side was a potential recruit for the enemy. The mathematics of attrition, which had always been brutal, became positively nightmarish when you had to account for the possibility that every soldier you lost would stand back up and start fighting against you. The siege of Vrax was a harbinger of what was to come. The zombie plague had demonstrated its effectiveness as a force multiplier in a conventional military campaign, and the forces of Nurgle had taken note. In the years and decades that followed, the plague would be deployed with increasing frequency and sophistication, refined and improved by the endless experimentation of the plague god and his servants, until it became one of the most consistently dangerous threats facing the Imperium of man. But before we move to the broader galactic picture, there is one more story to tell. A smaller story, set in the claustrophobic confines of a single hive city on a single world, as far from the grand battlefields and the cosmic conflicts that define the setting. It is the story of Karloth Valois, the zombie master of Necromunda, and it serves as a reminder that the zombie plague is not just a weapon of war. It is a fact of life in the far future, a danger that lurks in the shadows of every imperial world, waiting for the right combination of despair and disease to bring it surging to the surface. Necromunda is a hive world, one of millions of such planets scattered across the Imperium, each one a towering monument to human industry and human misery. Its population numbers in the billions, crammed into vast hive cities that stretch from the barren surface of the planet to the very edge of the atmosphere. At the top of these hives live the nobility and the wealthy, and breathing filtered air and eating real food and enjoying the closest thing to luxury that the 41st millennium has to offer. At the bottom, in the underhive, where the light never reaches and the recycled air is thick with pollutants, and the only law is the law of the strongest, things are very different. The underhive of Necromunda is a place of perpetual darkness and perpetual danger. It is home to gangs and outcasts, mutants and heretics, criminal enterprises and religious cults, all existing in a state of constant, low-level warfare that the authorities in the upper hive either cannot or will not suppress. It is also home to things that have crept up from the deepest, most forgotten levels of the hive, things that have been festering in the darkness for centuries, growing and mutating and waiting for the right moment to emerge. Long ago, Necromunda was swept by a mysterious neurone plague that boiled up from the underhive and reached even the highest levels of the spire. The victims of the plague fell ill for varying lengths of time depending on their constitution. If they succumbed, their brains were rotted by the terrible disease. All higher reasoning was lost, and the victims became little more than beasts. Unfortunately, beasts still need to eat. Soon, thousands of brainless, half-dead plague victims roamed the corridors and walkways of the hive, seeking flesh to feast on. The neurone plague was eventually contained, or at least it burned itself out, as plagues sometimes do when they have consumed everything available. But it never truly went away. It lurked in the deepest, dampest, most inaccessible corners of the underhive, it waiting in stagnant pools and decomposing bodies, and the cracks in the walls where moisture collects and things grow that should not grow. The plague zombies that resulted from periodic outbreaks became a recognized hazard of underhive life, one more danger to be navigated by the gangs and scavengers who made their living in the darkness below. Into this environment came Karloth Valois. Karloth was a weird, the underhive term for a person with latent psychic abilities. His powers manifested as flashes of precognition, nightmarish visions of possible futures, and an overwhelming sensitivity to the thoughts and emotions of those around him. In the crowded, teeming environment of the hive city, where billions of minds pressed against his consciousness like a crushing weight, these abilities were not a gift but a torment. Unable to block out the psychic noise that bombarded him from every direction, Karloth fled downward, seeking isolation in the deepest and most desolate regions of the underhive where few other humans ventured. He nearly died in the wasteland at the bottom of the hive, starving and exhausted and alone. And then the plague zombies found him. They came at him out of the darkness, a pack of shambling, decaying things with their empty eyes and their grasping hands, and their relentless, mindless hunger. Karloth ran until his body could carry him no further, and then he collapsed, and the zombies fell upon him, biting and clawing at his flesh. He should have died there, in the filth and the darkness, another anonymous victim of the underhive's countless hazards. But something happened. As the zombies fed on him and the neurone plague from their bites began to spread through his brain, Karloth's psychic abilities underwent a dramatic transformation. The plague, which should have destroyed his higher functions and reduced him to just another mindless shambler, instead interacted with his latent powers in a way that no one could have predicted. He became aware of the plague zombies in a way that went beyond physical perception. He could sense the tiny fragments of mind that remained within them, the residual hunger that drove their actions, the raw instincts that governed their behavior, and he found that he could influence those instincts. With a supreme effort of will, Karloth reached out with his newly altered psychic abilities and touched the minds of the zombies that were devouring him. He quelled their hunger. He forced them to stop. He made them stand back and leave him alone. He lay there in the impenetrable darkness, surrounded by plague zombies that now stood motionless and obedient around him, as the virus spread through his system and transformed him into something that was neither fully alive nor fully dead. But Karloth had also discovered that he could do something else, something that would allow him to survive even the plague's worst effects. He could draw the tiny slivers of life force that still existed within the zombies into himself, feeding on the remnants of their stolen vitality to sustain his own failing body. Karloth Valois had become a psychic vampire, a being who subsisted on the life energy of others and who commanded armies of the undead through sheer force of will. He was, in the parlance of the Underhive, the zombie master. What followed was a saga that became legendary in the Underhive of Necromunda. Karloth took to a wandering existence, drifting through the wastelands at the bottom of the hive with his growing retinue of plague zombies, preying on the living when he could, making deals with gangs who were desperate enough to seek his aid, and leaving a trail of drained, lifeless bodies in his wake. His reputation grew. He became feared throughout the Underhive, whispered about in the drinking holes and fighting pits as a soul thief and a life-taker, a being who had made a pact with the dark gods and who could command the dead with a thought. The Cult of the Redemption, a fanatical religious movement within the Underhive that sought to cleanse the lower levels of all heresy and corruption through the liberal application of fire. They took particular interest in Karloth. They saw him as the embodiment of everything they opposed, a heretic who had embraced the powers of the warp and who used the dead as his personal army. They hunted him through the wastelands, their flamers driving him ever deeper into the most hostile and inaccessible regions of the hive bottom. The chase lasted for months, perhaps years. Karloth was betrayed and driven away at every turn, as even the most hardened Underhivers feared either him or the Redemption too much to offer him shelter. For a time, he hid among the scavies, the mutant scavenger communities that existed in the most toxic and polluted regions of the hive bottom. But even there, the Redemption found him. The final confrontation took place on the very edge of the abyss, at a bottomless chasm at the deepest point of the Underhive, where the foundations of the hive city gave way to a darkness so complete that no light could penetrate it, and no one who fell into it was ever seen again. With his back to the void and nowhere left to run, Karloth turned to face the red-robed priests of the Redemption, and a battle was joined that would be remembered in the Underhive for generations. The zombie hordes charged into the flamers of the Redemption, and the burning bodies of the dead fell into the darkness below like torches dropped into a well. Karloth drained the life from the priests, even as his zombies tore into their flesh, leaving them as withered, desiccated husks. But the Redemptionists were fanatics, driven by a zeal that bordered on insanity, and they pressed on regardless of losses, as their flamers cutting through rank upon rank of the rotting dead. In the end, faced with the choice between capture and death, Karloth chose the only option left to him. He turned and threw himself into the abyss, shrieking his defiance of death as he plummeted into the bottomless darkness below. The Redemptionists searched for weeks. They found nothing. But as every Underhiver knows, nothing can be found in the abyss that does not wish to be found. And somewhere in the deepest darkness of Necromunda's foundations, Karloth Valois may still be lurking, sustained by whatever scraps of life energy he can find, surrounded by his faithful dead, waiting for the day when the plague rises again and the hive fills once more with the moaning of the undead. The story of Karloth Valois is significant not because of its scale, which is tiny compared to the galaxy-spanning campaigns of the Death Guard, but because of what it reveals about the nature of the zombie plague. The plague is not just a weapon of the Chaos Gods. It is a part of the ecology of the 41st Millennium, a naturally occurring phenomenon in the same way that warp storms and demonic incursions and psychic awakening are naturally occurring phenomena in a universe where the barriers between reality and unreality are perpetually thin. It does not require a Death Guard sorcerer to summon it, or a plague fleet to deliver it. It can bubble up from the depths of a hive city on its own, triggered by nothing more than the ambient warp energy that permeates every corner of the galaxy, and the despair that fills the hearts of the Imperium's forgotten billions. Well, this is what makes the zombie plague so difficult to combat. You can destroy Typhus's fleet. You can purge a Death Guard warband from a contested sector. You can burn every plague zombie on a given world and sterilize the landscape with orbital bombardment. But you cannot eliminate despair. You cannot vaccinate against hopelessness. You cannot quarantine a population against the creeping, insidious whisper of Nurgle's voice, telling them that it would be easier to just stop fighting, to just let go, to just accept the gifts that the Grandfather so generously offers. And that is why the Imperium created the Ordo Sepulturum. The Ordo Sepulturum is one of the newest and smallest branches of the Imperial Inquisition, the secretive organization tasked with protecting the Imperium from threats that conventional military forces cannot adequately address. It was formed in the years leading up to the 13th Black Crusade, when the increasing frequency and severity of zombie plague outbreaks in the sectors surrounding the Cadian Gate caught the attention of several inquisitors who realized that the phenomenon required a dedicated, specialized response. The driving force behind the Ordo's creation was a group of inquisitors belonging to the Thorian philosophical faction, a school of thought within the Inquisition that is particularly interested in the nature of the Emperor of mankind's current state. The Thorians believe that the Emperor, who has been entombed on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, or maintained in a state somewhere between life and death by the ancient and failing technology of the throne and the psychic energy of 1,000 psykers sacrificed to sustain him each day, represents a unique opportunity for the study of consciousness, soul, and the relationship between the material body and the warp. The zombie plague fascinated the Thorians because it presented an analogous phenomenon on a smaller scale. Like the Emperor on the Golden Throne, plague zombies were beings whose physical bodies had died, but whose existence continued through the intervention of warp energy. The parallels were not perfect, of course. The Emperor's continued existence served the cause of humanity's survival, while the existence of plague zombies served the cause of humanity's destruction. But the underlying mechanism, the use of warp energy to sustain a form of consciousness in a physically dead body, was similar enough to warrant intensive study. The Inquisitor, who is most commonly credited with the Ordo's formation, was a Gastri, a Thorian who recognized that the zombie plague represented both a threat that required immediate action and a scientific opportunity that could not be ignored. Agastri and his colleagues worked to coordinate the efforts of the various inquisitors who were already investigating the plague, pooling their resources and their knowledge into a single focused organization that could respond to outbreaks quickly and effectively, while also collecting data and samples for ongoing research. The Ordo Sepulturum's mandate is, in theory, straightforward: investigate and combat the threat posed by plague zombies, poxwalkers, and the various strains of the zombie plague to the Imperium of man. In practice, this mandate is anything but straightforward, because the zombie plague is a threat that does not respect the boundaries between the Ordo's area of expertise and those of other branches of the Inquisition. The plague is a biological phenomenon, which means it falls partially under the purview of the Officio Medici and the broader imperial medical establishment. It is also a warp phenomenon, which means it falls partially under the purview of the Ordo Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition that deals with demonic threats. And it is a tool of the traitor legions, which means it falls partially under the purview of the Ordo Hereticus, the branch that deals with internal threats to the Imperium and the Death Watch, and the Chamber Militant that specializes in combating alien threats, but which has also been deployed against Chaos forces on numerous occasions. The Ordo Sepulturum has had to navigate these overlapping jurisdictions, while simultaneously dealing with a threat that is growing more diverse and more dangerous with every passing year. Since the opening of the Great Rift, the Ordo's responsibilities have expanded dramatically. No longer confined to the sectors surrounding the Cadian Gate, the Ordo now operates across the entire galaxy, dispatching inquisitors and their retinues to investigate outbreaks wherever they occur and to implement containment protocols before the plague can reach critical mass. These containment protocols are brutally simple. Identify the infected, isolate them from the uninfected population, burn the dead within 6 minutes of death to prevent reanimation. If the outbreak has progressed beyond the point of containment, evacuate whatever portion of the population can be saved and sterilize the rest. In extreme cases, when a world has been so thoroughly consumed by the plague that there is nothing left to save, the Ordo has been known to recommend exterminatus, the complete destruction of the planet's surface by orbital bombardment. The Ordo has shown itself to be willing to act with the same ruthlessness that characterizes the rest of the Inquisition. Worlds that might have been saved have been sacrificed because the risk of the plague spreading to neighboring systems was deemed too great. Populations that included millions of uninfected civilians have been condemned to death alongside the zombies, because the logistics of separating the healthy from the sick were considered too complicated and too time-consuming. The Ordo Sepulturum does not have the luxury of compassion. It deals in triage on a planetary scale, and the calculus it employs is one of cold, unfeeling mathematics. How many worlds can be saved if this one is sacrificed? How many lives can be preserved if these lives are spent? It is a grim business, the grimest of the grim, and the inquisitors who serve in the Ordo Sepulturum are among the most haunted and psychologically damaged members of an organization that is already notorious for the toll it takes on the mental health of its operatives. They spend their careers surrounded by death and decay, confronting the walking dead on a daily basis, making decisions that will result in the deaths of millions, and carrying the weight of knowledge that the threat they are fighting can never truly be defeated, only managed. But there is one aspect of the Ordo's research that provides a glimmer of something that might almost be called hope, if hope is a word that has any meaning in the grim darkness of the far future. The Thorians who founded the Ordo believed that the study of the zombie plague could shed light on the nature of the Emperor's existence on the Golden Throne, and they have made some interesting discoveries in that direction. The warp energy that animates a plague zombie operates in a manner that bears a striking resemblance to the mechanism by which the Golden Throne sustains the Emperor's life functions. Both involve the use of chaos-derived energy to maintain a state of existence that falls somewhere between life and death. Both involve the preservation of some form of consciousness, however degraded, in a physically dead or dying body. The implications are profound and deeply troubling. Some Thorians have speculated that the zombie plague may be an offshoot of the very technology used to modify the Golden Throne, perhaps created by the Dark Mechanicum tech priests, who reside within the Eye of Terror alongside the Chaos Space Marines of the Traitor Legions. Every attempt at creating a stable version of the plague that would allow wounded servants of the Imperium to live on as functional beings, a kind of controlled reanimation that could be used for the benefit of the Imperium rather than its destruction, and has resulted in mutation and failure. But the research continues, driven by the hope that somewhere in the tangled biology and theology of the zombie plague, there lies a secret that could help the Imperium understand the nature of its own godlike emperor and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to save him. It is a long shot. It is probably a fool's errand. But in the 41st millennium, where everything is falling apart, and the only thing keeping the lights on is the collective refusal of 1 trillion human beings to admit that the situation is hopeless. Long shots and fool's errands are sometimes all you have. The era Indomitus, the current age of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, is a time of unprecedented danger and unprecedented change for the Imperium of man. The Great Rift has split the galaxy in two. The returned Primarch, Robute Guilliman, has launched the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military campaign to reconnect the scattered elements of the Imperium and bring reinforcement and hope to worlds that have been cut off from the light of the Astronomicon. New weapons and new soldiers, the Primaris Space Marines, have been deployed to bolster the Imperium's defenses, and the forces of chaos, emboldened by the opening of the rift and the flood of warp energy that it has released into real space, are more active and more dangerous than they have been at any point since the Horus Heresy. For the zombie plague, the era Indomitus has been a golden age. The proliferating energies of chaos that pour through the Great Rift have supercharged the plague in ways that no one anticipated, or strains that were once confined to the sectors around the Eye of Terror have now spread across the galaxy, carried by plague fleets and infected refugees, and the simple, inexorable movement of warp energy through the material universe. Worlds that had never known the touch of Nurgle now find themselves battling outbreaks of the curse of unbelief. Sectors that had been considered safe for millennia are now reporting their first encounters with plague zombies and poxwalkers. The Death Guard, under the leadership of their demon Primarch Mortarion, have become more active than they have been in centuries. Mortarion, who spent much of the post-heresy period brooding on his demon world in the Eye of Terror, was stirred to action by the opening of the rift and the arrival of Guilliman. The two Primarchs, yet brothers who had never been close even before the heresy, found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that played out across the realm of Ultramar, the sector of space that Guilliman called home. The Plague Wars, as this campaign came to be known, saw the Death Guard unleash their full arsenal of biological weaponry against one of the most civilized and well-defended regions of the galaxy, and the zombie plague was a significant component of their strategy. Typhus, ever the opportunist, used the chaos of the Plague Wars to pursue his own agenda. He led a splinter fleet into the outer regions of Ultramar, terrorizing worlds that had never known the touch of the Plague God, and spreading the walking pox among populations that had no experience with or defense against supernatural disease. His relationship with Mortarion, always strained, had deteriorated further. Typhus openly mocked and belittled his Primarch, claiming that he was closer to Nurgle's true vision than Mortarion had ever been. The Herald of Nurgle had long since moved beyond any loyalty to his legion or its master. His only allegiance was to the Plague God himself, and as long as Nurgle's will was being served, Typhus was content to operate independently. The Plague Wars eventually ended, not with a decisive victory for either side, but with a messy, inconclusive withdrawal, as Nurgle's attention was drawn elsewhere by the machinations of rival Chaos Gods. But the damage had been done. Worlds across Ultramar had been contaminated, populations had been decimated, and the walking pox had established a foothold in a region of space that had previously been considered one of the Imperium's safest. The zombie plague continues to evolve. New strains appear regularly, each one a testament to Nurgle's relentless creativity and the adaptability of the biological and supernatural mechanisms that underlie the infection. The Imperium's response, led by the Ordo Sepulturum and supported by the broader military and ecclesiastical infrastructure, has become more sophisticated over time, but it remains fundamentally reactive. The Imperium cannot predict where the next outbreak will occur or what form it will take. It can only respond after the fact, rushing to contain each new manifestation of the plague before it reaches the tipping point beyond which containment becomes impossible. There is one more thing that deserves mention before we bring this accounting to a close, and it is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the zombie plague in the current era. In the aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade and the opening of the Great Rift, Imperial scholars have noted a disturbing trend. The zombie plague is becoming self-sustaining. In the past, major outbreaks typically required the direct intervention of chaos agents, a death guard sorcerer to perform the necessary rituals, a plague fleet to deliver the initial infection vector, or at the very least, a significant influx of warp energy from a nearby rift or storm to power the plague's supernatural components. But increasingly, outbreaks are occurring in areas where no chaos activity has been detected, where no sorcerer has performed any ritual, and no plague fleet has been sighted. The plague is generating itself, feeding on the ambient despair and the background level of warp energy that now permeates the galaxy thanks to the Great Rift, emerging spontaneously on worlds that have done nothing to attract Nurgle's attention and everything to merit it. This is the nightmare scenario that the Ordo Sepulturum has always feared. A zombie plague that does not require an external trigger. A disease that generates its own infection events, that creates its own outbreaks, that needs nothing more than the misery and hopelessness that are the default condition of human existence in the 41st millennium to spark into life. If this trend continues, if the plague truly becomes self-sustaining on a galactic scale, then no amount of military force, no number of inquisitors, no quantity of holy flame and bolter rounds will be sufficient to contain it. The zombie plague will become a permanent feature of human existence, as inescapable as death itself, a constant companion to every world and every population in the Imperium. And Nurgle, in his garden in the warp, will smile his terrible smile, because this is what he has always wanted. Not the destruction of humanity, but its transformation. Not death, but something worse than death. An existence that is neither living nor dead, neither conscious nor unconscious, neither free nor truly enslaved. A state of being that is defined not by what it possesses, but by what it has lost, and that goes on and on and on without end. Because in Nurgle's garden, nothing ever truly dies. The zombie plague is not just a disease. It is a philosophy. It is a worldview made manifest in rotting flesh and shambling limbs and the endless hollow moaning of things that used to be people. It is the Plague Lord's answer to the question that every mortal being asks at some point in their existence. What happens when hope runs out? The answer is simple. The answer is terrible. The answer is walking toward you right now, and it is hungry. And that is where we will leave things for tonight. The dead will continue their endless march across the battlefields and hive cities and lonely frontier worlds of the 41st millennium. The Imperium will continue to fight them, burning the corpses and quarantining the infected, and making the hard, horrible choices that survival demands. Typhus will continue his wandering, spreading the gifts of Grandfather Nurgle to every corner of the galaxy. And somewhere in the warp, in a garden of impossible beauty and unspeakable horror, the Plague Lord himself will continue to experiment, to innovate, to create new and ever more terrible variations on the theme that has defined his existence since the first human being drew a ragged breath and coughed it out again in a spray of blood and phlegm. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in the ranks of the dead, there is something worse than war. There is the absence of everything that makes war worth fighting, the absence of hope, of purpose, of the simple human dignity of being allowed to die when your time has come. The zombie plague takes that away, and in taking it, it reveals the deepest, and darkest truth about the universe of Warhammer 40,000. That in a galaxy where gods drink the souls of mortals and the stars themselves are weapons. And the only certainty is that things will get worse before they get better. The most terrifying enemy is not the one that kills you. It is the one that will not let you stay dead. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the zombie plague and the horrors of Nurgle's domain, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps the channel grow and lets me know that you want to see more content like this. If you have a topic you would like to see covered in a future video, Drop it in the comments below, and I will add it to the list. And until next time, stay safe out there. Keep the faith. Burn the dead within 6 minutes. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, the only thing more dangerous than losing hope is letting someone else notice that you have. Thank you for listening, and as always, the Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.